Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about ground handling of the P-51 Mustang. And this really is a problem that I kind of see with a lot of this size warbird more than anything else. This 1.2 meter, the slightly larger, slightly smaller, but in this general range. People comment all the time. In fact, I just saw it again tonight on RC group. Someone's like, how do I get this airplane to work in the grass? And one of the things when I was looking at buying one of these for years, since the original Blondie came out, was you read so many articles about how, or so many posts that it doesn't work well in the grass, and they say if you have grass, don't even bother. Well, that's not entirely correct. You can make this work off the grass. After all, mine has flown exclusively off the grass, and will probably never see a hard surface runway for as long as I own it. I don't have access to a runway that is suitable. So if you only fly your P-51 or your 1.2 meter warbirds off of a hard surface, you might as well just go ahead and skip this video. But for those of you like me that have to figure out how to get an airplane of this size to work off grass, I'm here to help you. So there's a couple things that we're gonna talk about on this, and it involves a little trial and error. So not everything is going to work for you, and some things may work better. So we're going to kind of cover these things a little bit as we go along. The first thing to talk about is the type of grass that you're going to be flying off of. If you're flying off a soccer field that's got grass, 3 inches thick, you're probably going to be doomed. After all, I've nosed over a timber without any problem in grass that thick. It's just, it's unrealistic that you would try to taxi an aircraft like this in grass that thick. If you're trying to do this in let's say spring and early summer, when grass is growing at an extremely fast rate and it's very thick, even though you cut it often, you still may find that there's a lot of rolling resistance. And if you get a lot of rolling resistance on the landing gear, it's going to tend to stop the wheel from turning, and it's going to want to nose over. So it's just a matter of physics. You just pivot around that surface. So what I'm going to end up doing with mine is primarily flying it later in the season. So midsummer to the end of summer, when the grass is not growing as much, it's not watered as much, so it's drier. It's not growing as thick. That gives you a better surface to work through. Plus, for me, living in Michigan, that works out well because I usually need to get all the rust off my skills the first half of the season anyway before I'm ready to tackle something like this. So be advised that the type of grass you're dealing with, you may end up with some different results. So just be aware of that. But if you fly off a club field or your own field and you have the ability to cut it with either a lawn, like a lawn and garden tractor, or your push mower, and you're able to get it down to its lowest setting possible, you are in the range that this will absolutely work on the grass, with a few things that need to be done. So on this aircraft here, what I've ended up doing is I started with the battery all the way forward in the nose, and I set it with a more forward center of gravity per what the manual suggested. I started with the manual, then went about 3 millimeters forward of that. Because for a maiden flight, you kind of want to start with a nose heavy aircraft, and then you can kind of work back. Well, now I've started to work into the phase where I can begin to work backwards. Because of some of the paint and things I added to the aircraft, I had to add a ½ ounce of lead weight to the nose. That's since been removed. I don't need that anymore. Found out that didn't really help or hinder anything. So to help get some of the weight out of the nose, I took that out. I also put a brass rod in the tail. And the reason I did in the vertical or the horizontal stabulator here in the spar, it just slides straight in. The reason I did that is it just adds a little extra weight in the rear, because I'm still using the battery tray up front. And so because I wanted to use the battery tray, I still want to have that battery sitting up here in the nose. I felt comfortable adding a little bit of weight to the tail here, and then I can maybe shift the battery a little bit more. So I tried out those things there, and decided I'll even move the battery a little bit further back on the battery tray. And then what I'm kind of doing is I'm seeing how does the aircraft behave on the grass and how does it behave in the air, making sure that at no time do I end up with an aircraft that is too tail heavy to fly, or too nose heavy to move on the ground. So you're just going to have to play around with the center of gravity a little bit, but keep it within the acceptable range for the aircraft. You don't want to set an airplane up that is great on ground handling, and as soon as you get it in the air, it's way too tail heavy and it crashes. So it's a little bit of fine tuning and adjustment, but the biggest improvement that you can make to improving the ground handling of the P-51 Mustang, or really any of the warbirds that feature landing gear that kind of retract in line with the long axis of the wings, so the wing spar, so they kind of come up like this with the fuselage. There's something you can do that will make a significant improvement, and that is raking the gear forward. So let me go into a little bit more detail on that. So to do that, I'm going to flip the plane over here and put it up on a stand. Got my trusty PVC stand that I made that is very helpful. All right, so let's go ahead and flip the aircraft over here and talk about how to improve the landing gear. And this really, out of everything I've done, this was it. This was the magic formula that really made the most difference. And when I talk about raking the gear forward, what I'm talking about is I'm changing the angle of which the landing gear strut is in relation to the wing. So the further forward you can move the wheels, the less moment arm you have between the axis of the wheel here where it's touching the ground and the nose. So if you can shorten this distance up, you are basically creating a smaller lever arm, and the further you move it from the tail, the bigger you're making the tail lever arm, which is giving you kind of torque. It's force times distance here. So you're helping the aircraft stay stable on the ground by moving the landing gear further forward. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's actually extremely easy. It's a trick I learned a couple years ago on some of my other planes, and I brought that same trick over to the P-51. And the thing I've learned about it is you have to go a little bit more extreme on an aircraft like this, on a warbird, than you do on some of the other ones. And so to rake the gear forward, you're going to want to take the retract housing out of the aircraft, and on the back screws here, the rear-facing two screws, you're going to add some shims. And what I use are 3mm metric washers. They're small. They're just big enough to fit over the thread of the screw, and they're thin, which means you can stack them up and fine-tune it till you get where it's exactly right. When I started with this one, I think I used like 3 washers in both screws in the back. So that pivoted the gear slightly forward. What I found out is that the aircraft still had a very high tendency to nose over when I had that arrangement. So I started playing around with the center of gravity. I got it a little bit better, but you had to be spot on with applying the throttle and using maximum full up elevator and kind of getting that timing just right to get enough airflow from the prop over the elevator in order to keep the tail pin. It was very sketchy when I first started. So I went back and I started adding more shims. So I think I'm up to, let's see, I think there's 6 in there right now. I just added a few more to it. And that's what I'd consider, this is pretty far extreme. I doubled the amount of shims that I put in the landing gear. I tipped this even farther forward. And of course you gotta be thinking, well, if you tip the gear forward, how's it gonna retract in the housing? Well, it retracts just fine. The reason is because you're changing the axis in which the retract is pivoting. So by moving the retract housing forward and the trunnion forward and changing the angle of the gear, when it retracts, it goes down into the wheel well. What it's doing is it's actually raising the rear of the gear door up in the wing, and that's where you're going to get a little bit of a fitment issue compared to what the factory. However, for my Beater 51 project, these retracts don't fit anywhere near flush compared to my new 1.2 meter P-51 that they're pretty well flush. These do not. So the gear retract just fine. They go into the wheel well just fine. You're just changing the angle that they retract into the wing, and you'll be absolutely fine. After all, these are not perfect fits anyway on the gear. So I highly suggest getting some 3mm washers. You can buy them at your hardware store. I bought a pack of like 100 from McMaster-Carr, and the rate that I go through them, 100 of them don't last very long. And what's nice about those 3mm washers is you can continually add and subtract. So if you start to say, yep, still got a tendency to nose over, take it back apart, add some more to it, move that gear forward and try it again. And if you start to say, yep, I'm comfortable with it, I can handle the aircraft now, you can start dialing it back and see, you know, where that sweet spot is. So you can change the angle of the gear, the rake of the gear, you could change your center of gravity a little bit, and those are ways that you can really improve the ground handling of this aircraft and make it suitable to use on the grass. The other part of it is when you are trying to either taxi or more importantly take off, is trying to use the controller properly. And to do that, you need to advance the throttle just enough to get the airflow moving over the tail to keep it pinned. However, not too much in which you end up kind of torque rolling the aircraft over on the ground. You need to be on the right rudder, which will, as you're going down the runway, you're going to need to add a lot of right rudder to counteract the torque that the propeller is giving off. And you need to be ready on the aileron as well, because you're going to have one wing that's actually going to want to take off before the other wing because of the natural tendency for the aircraft to resist the torque of the prop. So you got a lot of things going on there. You also need to make sure you lift off the elevator when you gain enough ground speed so that the tail will come up, and you want to continually build that speed up until you can finally lift the aircraft off and suck the gear up, and away you go. Once in the air, the aircraft is absolutely a joy to fly. It is perfect, but ground handling does take a little bit of effort to get it right. It's a little bit of a little bit of art and a little bit of science and a little bit of luck to get all of that to come together. But the thing that really made the most amount of difference was raking that gear forward. So if you fly one of these aircraft off the grass and you are having trouble with it nosing over, I highly, highly, highly suggest you rake the gear forward to start with. Start playing around with your center of gravity a little bit. Start moving it back just a little and just kind of see where the aircraft is at that right balance point where you feel comfortable flying it in the air. It doesn't feel tail heavy, but it also has good ground handling. And if you can, reduce the amount of time you spend taxiing the airplane. Most of the times when I see people have incidents, it's when they are taxiing the airplane, not flying the airplane or taking off. That's when they seem to get into trouble. They crash into things, they hit potholes in the grass, they do something and they damage the airplane. So the least amount of time you can spend on the ground, the better off you're gonna be. So if you're like me, I walk the airplane out to the runway, I find a spot that has the least amount of weeds, the shortest amount of grass, which is usually a high spot in the field, and I begin my takeoff roll from there. That gives me the maximum amount of luck or the maximum amount of chances to get the aircraft into the air. If you can get the airplane moving, usually I consider if you can get it past the first 5 feet, you're going to be absolutely just fine, because then you've built up enough speed where the aircraft is going to be okay. So as always, if you got any questions, please by all means leave them in the comments below. Either myself or Waffles the cat here will jump in and are more than happy to help out. But don't be discouraged by the aircraft on grass, and I would say don't buy the airplane because you read somewhere that it can't handle grass. It can handle grass. It just might need a little tweaking out of the box to get it to work right. And I'm telling you what, it's 100% worth it to make those small little tweaks, because when you fly the aircraft, it is extremely rewarding. If you're huge into warbirds like I am, there's almost nothing more beautiful than a P-51 Mustang flying in the air, and you can certainly make that happen with a few changes if you happen to fly off grass. So thanks again for taking the time and watching the video. Leave your comments below.